And you're trying to give the young people something that will help them, yet you don't know exactly what it ought to be.
Hello again, and thanks for tuning into the podcast once again. My name is Drew Perkins, and I'm the Director of TeachThought Professional Development, and I'm happy to have you join us for what we try to do, which is to have heterodox and complex and interesting and sometimes difficult conversations about things that will hopefully help you as an educator better prepare students for the modern world. Speaking of preparing students for the modern world, our professional development services are, of course, all geared towards that, and everything that we do is through the lens of inquiry and personalized to meet the needs of you and your school and your district. So if you are looking for ways to better prepare your students for the modern world, please navigate on over to wegrowteachers.com, where you'll find our workshops and our services, including project-based learning, differentiated instruction, and a whole host of inquiry-centered and student-focused professional development options for your school. In this episode, I spoke with Andrea Keith, who is the Executive Director of Moral Courage Ed and also associated with Let Grow, that you might be familiar with my recent conversation with Lenore Skenazy on the podcast, who's the author of Free Range Kids. The initial parts of our conversation focused more on the Let Grow and how an educator's perspective, which is what Andrea brings to the conversation, might have on some of those things that are associated with growing independence and autonomy in students and kids through the Let Grow projects and some of the ways in which I actually have done that with my daughters. And so we talked about the ways in which that might look in an educational setting and, of course, with schools and outside of schools as well. And I'd say maybe the latter two-thirds of this episode, we focused on the moral courage education pieces that she is involved with. And the goal or aim of Moral Courage Ed is to help us have better conversations and have dialogue as opposed to argument, and do so productively around sensitive issues. So ways in which we might focus on critical thinking and, again, having some constructive dialogue as opposed to yelling at each other and engaging in the us versus them stuff. And so we talked about some of the complexity inherent in that issue and talked about the emotional versus rational and some of the assumptions that people make, and shifting away from trying to be right and winning versus trying to understand the role of inquiry and humanity and shared connections, and touched on how maybe critical race theory and racism, anti-racism plays into this conversation, and then even some of the things like vaccinations and things that might be touchy issues or things pushed by the right, and ended the conversation on an interesting idea or question of what role schools play in social justice advocacy versus activism, and how that and Moral Courage Ed might approach that question. So I hope it's helpful. Okay, well, we are live and recording, and I'm here via Zoom with Andrea Keith, who's going to talk about who knows what. We're going to talk about moral courage ed and cancel culture and see where that conversation leads us. And to do that and to get us started, Andrea, why don't you give our listeners a bit of background on who you are and how you came to the esteemed position that you are in.
Well, hi, Drew. Excited to be here and always love to talk about wherever we may go. I've been in education for my entire career. I started out as an elementary school teacher and eventually ended up in education technology. So I have a background kind of on the vendor side as well. It gives me a kind of a unique perspective. And so during the course of my career, I have primarily worked with the empowerment of children in a number of different areas, both in keeping students safe and empowering them to use technology, as well as a company that taught the process of innovation, which at the time I said, there's a process, and yes, there is. But all along the way, it's always been about helping kids succeed. So I was very fortunate to get connected with Let Grow about a year and a half ago. And I came on board to bring a school's perspective and help get our Let Grow project and Let Grow Play Club, both of which are free programs that we provide in order to help kids become more independent, because we believe that a lot of anxiety and problems that kids are having today is related to a loss of the free play and the independence that previous generations, have enjoyed. And so when we started with that, about the same time I joined, I was also introduced to Irshad Manji, who joined Let Grow to kind of bring a nice continuum to what it is we're doing. So Let Grow's focus on childhood independence started as more independence of behavior. And the idea that if kids do things by themselves, like cook their own breakfast, like ride their bike to their friend's house, those types of things, that they develop the social emotional skills that are so crucial as a foundation for becoming an adult later. And so as we were working on that, we realized our focus was a K-8 focus. And I know you've spoken with Lenore Skenazy a number of times, who's our co-founder and has turned into a very dear friend of mine. But we figured out that we didn't really have much to continue from that about 8th grade level up into high school and adulthood. And yet our founders, who include Jonathan Haidt and Daniel Schuckman, both felt very strongly that the loss of childhood independence was a problem that carries into adulthood, that we are seeing college students who can't handle college for a number of reasons and don't know how to communicate across disagreements. And you mentioned cancel culture. We can get into all of those things. So they saw that this was a continuum of the issue of childhood independence brings us up into adulthood, and those problems are manifest in our adults because they did not learn in the beginning how to communicate, how to cross their ideas and differing viewpoints and things like that. So when we brought Irshad on, it was really to bring us the idea of moral courage as something that we could be sharing with older students, understanding that the foundation of the independence of behavior is crucial to then build the ability to have independence of thought and also appreciate independence of viewpoints. So I've had this fabulous journey over the last year and a half, getting to know Irshad, working on all of the things we've put together for the website and everything. And wow, impactful, powerful, and I've learned a lot. So I'm super fortunate to be in a position to bring both of these wonderful philosophies together with our mission out to the world of education.
Yeah, and listeners, if they have listened to the podcast for any length of time, will remember and notice that I talked with Irshad a couple times. Actually, I ran into her in Washington, D.C. when I was there several years ago before COVID with my daughters on a vacation. We were sitting in a restaurant, and I looked at her and I said, I think that's Irshad Manji. And just serendipitously had a chance to say hello. And of course, I talked with Lenore Skenazy a couple weeks ago and actually engaged in one of the Let Grow projects that not exactly a project that was detailed, but an idea of doing something like that with my daughters, who are 12 and 14, and so we did. I asked them to go into Kroger, which is our local grocery store, to do some shopping for some food for the food bank, the homeless food bank. And then with my 12-year-old, I asked her to decide what to make for dinner, make a list of things to go in and purchase those things in Kroger. And Lenore has written me and some of that experience up in a blog on her blog piece, or I guess it's on is that on Let Grow? I'm not sure exactly.
It's on Let Grow.
Yeah. So I'm highly sympathetic, and listeners will remember Jonathan Haidt being on the podcast and Greg Lukianoff, who I think is at least somewhat connected. So yeah, I'm sympathetic. And so you've got Moral Courage, you've got Let Grow, and one of the things that's interesting to me is, as I've been thinking a bit more about the free range kids idea and the independence and the sort of loss of independence that we seem to be fostering. Technology is not helping. COVID is certainly not helping. And I'm wondering, as I thought about this a little bit, like demographically, and I think this is an interesting wrinkle as it might connect to moral courage because of cancel culture and equity and diversity and all these things. I can imagine somebody being critical not necessarily of the idea of free range kids and Let Grow, but that I wonder if there's a particular demographic or part of the population of kids who actually is experiencing more independence, sometimes perhaps more than they should in some cases. But I don't know, it struck me as an interesting wrinkle in this whole conversation of, higher socioeconomic status students or kids perhaps having this particular problem of lack of independence and helicopter or lawnmower parenting, and some of the lower socioeconomic students or kids not necessarily experiencing that. So I just threw a lot out there, and feel free to expound or ignore whatever you like.
Actually, Drew, I think you're bringing up an excellent point, and it's one that when I first started working with Let Grow, I was highly sensitive to, and that is the idea that helicopter parenting and lawnmower parenting has a tendency to be perceived as being a higher income problem. That these are students who don't do their own laundry and don't take care of chores and things at home because they don't have to. And I know that that's a small percentage of our population. My background has always been in the public school arena, and so I am highly sensitive to the idea that what happens on Long Island in a private school is very, very different than what's going on in Baltimore public schools.
Right.
And so the concept of equity is something that you actually really hit on, something that I recognized early on, even before the pandemic, and that was that we tend to feel or treat students in lower socioeconomic demographics in certain neighborhoods or certain schools and those populations as being disadvantaged, which is true in a number of ways and something that we need to be aware of and be dealing with. But in some ways, I look at it as the child independence, as there are certain kids from certain backgrounds and certain cultures that actually have a huge advantage when it comes to the independence, that due to their circumstances or their tendency maybe to have larger families and the kids are taking care of their younger siblings and things like that, those kids are actually developing a set of social emotional skills that children who have, more money, more activities that their parents are driving them to, fewer responsibilities, are not getting. The idea that kids are taking care of the other kids in the household, they're doing the chores, they're cooking the meals. Yes, there's probably a number of kids out there with too much on their shoulders. But at the same time, if we look at the history of our country, if we look at our entrepreneurs and the leaders that we look up to over the last couple of generations, many of them have come from childhoods where they had that level of independence. And so they learned a lot of those types of things. So on the one hand, yes, we're talking helicopter parents and a certain class or type of family that may be worse at this, if we can put it that way, than others. I choose to look at it, though, as a positive that, wow, let's recognize that a whole lot of these traits that these other kids are learning and are developing, that's just as crucial as being able to do high level mathematics. And I worry sometimes that we've skewed so much the other way with our push for everybody going to college and this particular pathway that we've tried to apply to all students. Now, we've done some disservice and didn't realize it at the time. We had great intentions, but yeah, there's kids out there that are going to be much better prepared for the complexities and difficulties of the world. And it's not because they came from privileged families and had every opportunity in the world.
Right. Yeah. So I suppose there's two different things here, and I'd like to, and I don't want to be redundant in our conversation with Lenore, but I do have an interesting, I think it's interesting to explore this a little further with an educator, as we were talking a little bit before we started recording. Mm-hmm. And Lenore, for all of her wonderful traits and wit and charm, of which she possesses much,
yes, she does,
as she acknowledges, is not an educator, was not, was I think a journalist by trade, right? So
yes.
Thinking through this as an educator and some of the conversations I've had with her, it's an interesting wrinkle. So thinking more about the free range kids and let grow, I suppose we think about in our work with teachers, we do a lot of project-based learning work, mm-hmm. and not only that, but certainly a lot of it. Everything that we do is through the lens of inquiry. But one of the pieces of our project-based learning model is autonomy, and there are other organizations that might use voice and choice and some of those things. Mm-hmm. And I think voice and choice is, of course, a wonderful thing to foster, but then taking that to the sort of a little more complexity or a little more sophistication of, let's develop autonomy in students, mm-hmm. to sort of direct their own learning, and not necessarily does that mean, just as a side note, that students are choosing what they get to learn all the time, that teachers are not in control, but that we want them to manage the process of working collaboratively or even working alone on completing a task, which to me is analogous in some ways, of course, to how we want students or kids to develop those skills outside of school. So I'm curious how you think about, perhaps differently or sharpen the points of let grow and free range, mm-hmm. kids from an educator perspective.
Absolutely. Again, discussions and debates I've had with Lenore over the last year and a half as she's educated me on things and I've educated her. I fully believe deep in my heart that project-based learning, the autonomy, students being able to, direct their own learning, this is wonderful. This is where we need to go. And my fear is we have an entire generation of kids who won't be able to do it. And they won't be able to do it because they have been brought up being told what to do, when to do it, where to do it, how to do it, and to seek approval as to whether they did it right or not. And because we have basically given these kids, again, best intentions, but we have essentially given these kids this message through be careful, or I'll do that for you, or that's too dangerous. We've taught them that they're not capable. We've taught them to be afraid of the world, and we've taught them to seek direction as to what am I supposed to do next, constantly from adults, be it in school, be it at sports practice, whatever types of activities they're doing, because they're all adult directed. And now we take these kids and we say, hey, you're in charge of your learning. Do this project, figure out how to get from point A to point B. They have no idea what to do. They don't have the foundational skills in order for project-based learning and student autonomy to truly be effective. And that scares me.
Yeah, it is an interesting. I mean, some of it's developmental, and
Sure.
some of it is something. I mean, I try to work on this with my own children, and I'm somewhat amazed at times, as is almost every parent. You say, I want you to do this, and they say, I don't know how to do this, or what would I do next? And you say, well, stop and think for a moment, right? Let's just think here, right? I've got a 14-year-old that is very bright.
Figure it out.
Right? I asked her to help me make dinner yesterday, and the good thing is she was asking questions instead of just saying, opting out or some version of that. But it is funny to see that developmental process. But I do think, again, in education, and I mentioned this, I don't know if I mentioned this in the podcast with Lenore or in a conversation with her, but the idea, I've mentioned this on the podcast before, in other episodes for sure, is the idea of a nation at risk perhaps being a bit of a turning point in how our schools were more focused on testing and accountability and answers and less on questions. And while I would acknowledge, or I think it's probably likely that teaching and learning and the quality and craft of teaching before a nation of risk wasn't necessarily super high level, and perhaps it has gotten better, or in ways it could have gotten better, but there was at least more freedom for folks my age, and I don't want to date you, and I know you're only about 26, but
Thanks.
but the teachers that I had, even the worst ones, had the ability and freedom to have discussions and to not be necessarily so beholden to tests and scores and rigid curriculum and pacing guides and all of those things. So I don't know if how do you think about that sort of equation?
Having been a child, obviously, and gone to school, I was fairly fortunate and had this amazing situation where I was gifted. I think I outgrew it. But I was gifted and talented early on when there were no programs, and I was fortunate enough to have some teachers along the way who absolutely tailored things for me to keep me engaged. My favorite teacher, shout out to Ted Oakey, who's still out there, was my middle school teacher, and in English realized that I didn't need to spend the time working on the grammar and those things, and let me do a independent study, and I read Shakespeare. And that's one of those amazing things that it's the kind of thing that, wow, when you're doing it right, get the kids engaged, keep them challenged, and let them go. I think, yes, you're right, that the whole concept of teaching to the test, and frankly, we have become a society that, for the industrial age, it served us well to educate students not only on basic knowledge, but a big part of it was on compliance and understanding how to follow the rules, how to play the game, how to regurgitate the information, how to take tests, and those types of things. And I think what we're finding is society has changed, technology has so changed the playing field that that is not going to get us the next step and the rest of the way. And we recognize, I think, as educators, and all educators, I think, feel like they want to do the fun stuff and the things that get those light bulbs flashing in their kids and those types of things. They want to do that. I went into teaching not because I thought, hey, this will be great. I can teach kids how to take a bubble test and stress out every year as to whether or not my numbers are where they need to be to prove that I actually had an impact. So I do think there's been a change, and I hope that we're starting to swing the other way. My concern is we now have a little bit of a disparity between kids who were brought up with a level of freedom and resilience and learned how to negotiate and play and communicate with their neighborhood friends, And then we stuck them in classrooms that that all looked the same and tried to get them all to kind of hit this minimum level. Now we're at this place where, gosh, we've really kind of molded our children into a do what you're told, and we'll guide you. We know what's best. And now we're trying to get them to have more autonomy. So somewhere we've got to meet in the middle and get that figured out.
So the Let Grow program, and again, I think Lenora and I talked a little bit about that, but I do want to, for anybody who's listening to this, if they haven't heard that one or didn't want to listen to it for whatever reason, what are the Let Grow education pieces, and especially if you can, so the idea of, and this is really pulling from Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff's book, Coddling the American Mind, of which I think is wonderful. And I highly recommend it to educators and non-educators. But one of the concepts that they introduced there that they pulled, I can't remember who it was from, but the idea of fragility, anti-fragility. And to me, that is just one of the essential pieces that is part of the work of Let Grow, of autonomy to independence and confidence and security in oneself. So what are the pieces that Let Grow does? I know you have some after-school programs, but also perhaps some other things that you say, all right, here's some things that we can do to help.
Right. The school programs are primarily, I'll be honest, the school programs are school programs because we know where the parents are. And we ultimately know that in order to change the culture, we need to change the parenting style. And while we're not saying that parents are bad or that they're necessarily doing things wrong, we have developed this culture and this societal pressure now to protect your child from everything. And that includes frustration or being upset or having their feelings hurt or, not so-and-so won't play with me. And we teach them that the adults will step in and take care of that problem, and we all have to be fair. And by smoothing everything over for them, they don't have the experiences of skinned knees, hurt feelings, and having to compromise in a group game in order to keep the game going. We've taken all of those opportunities to practice all of these skills away. And so we look at two things: the Let Grow Play Club. The Play Club it's a little tricky with the pandemic, but the Play Club is designed to be an after-school program where before and after school, schools open up their playground or their gym, and the kids can simply play. There's no rules, there's no organized games. You throw out what we call loose parts, which could be hula hoops, balls, buckets, pieces of wood, whatever is out there, and let the kids play. And they're in a mixed age group, as opposed to the way we segregate everybody into like ages, and let them go, and usually have one teacher that's kind of a lifeguard. They're not going to get in and solve the problems. They're not going to jump in and say, you have to follow this rule. They basically let the kids figure it out on their own. And kids do, after they go to the adult a few times and tattle and ask for help. And so it's funny because when I describe that in my own mind, having grown up the way I grew up, that's what recess was for me. That's what, before school, we all hung out on the playground before the bell rang. After school, some of us hung out, or we went home and then we said, hey mom, I'm home, and went back outside and did that kind of thing anyway. But we recognize that that's not happening as much, and it's tough because we mentioned equity and different demographics. There are kids who live in places that really shouldn't go out and play outside. It could actually be dangerous. But we look at the opportunity of having a play club at school. That is a safe place. And so what if those kids could stay after school for a couple of hours instead of going home, and be able to play with each other? So the play club is one school program. And again, we don't charge anything for this. We provide a full implementation guide on kind of how to set this up. Costs to a school are minimal, depending on, if you have to pay a teacher, depending on what your rules are, or if you've got a volunteer who's staying after school. And folks who do it have amazing results with these kids. And then the Let Grow project, as you mentioned, that you've essentially done with your daughters. The Let Grow project is actually a simple homework assignment that says, okay, today your homework is to go home and do something completely on your own that you've never done before without any parental help. We do have a guide for that as well, and a parent letter that goes home that helps explain to the parents that, yes, you have to approve it. So, kids don't go home and start juggling chainsaws. But the parents have to step back. And the fun thing about that is, because it's homework, parents are more likely to let the child do something that makes them feel a little uncomfortable. And the idea being that students do something, in almost every case, the parents are like, gosh, I didn't realize you were capable of that. Or, the kids are excited, as your daughters were coming out of the grocery store, to do something which, okay, let's go back again to our childhoods, Drew. I don't know about you, but I used to go at 8 or 9, walked to the 7-Eleven or rode my bike to the 7-Eleven with my best friend to get candy. And so a 14-year-old going into a grocery store by themselves, for our generation, was nothing.
Right.
But for them, it's a big deal because it hasn't happened. So the Let Grow project is so wonderfully adaptable, because no matter where a child is in their level of independence, they can find a project to have a Let Grow moment. So that kid who's never been allowed to, I don't know, oh gosh, there's 7th graders I've heard of that aren't allowed to cut their meat at dinner because the knife is sharp. And honestly, that horrifies me. Oh gosh, Drew, do your daughters cut their own meat? I should ask.
It's funny that you ask that, because just last night I cooked a pork loin and set the table. And at the table was a fork, just regular butter knife, spoon, and a steak knife. And so my 7th grader, soon to be 7th grader, was trying to cut her meat by herself, not particularly successfully. She was sort of mangling it. So I actually did step in and to show her. Sure. Because, one of the things that, as you were talking about how you would say, all right, educators can send this home and ask the parents to do, some of the things that strike me as probably necessary, you sort of implied them, but like a scaffolding process for parents, yes. Right? So we work with Project-Based Learning and talk about this, and the sort of, I joke about it and saying Project-Based Learning should not be what I call free-range chicken, like kids just wandering about doing whatever. Not particularly engaged, and say, here's your project, I'll see you in 3 weeks, and I really hope you learn some things and whatever. So we talk about this in the terms of autonomy. There's a graphic that we show that is like an XY axis, and essentially the top left is what would be more traditional teaching of very simple tasks and tight management by the adult, and then the bottom right would be the opposite, so complex tasks and very loose management, which some people think of as project-based learning. I say that's not project-based learning, that's a train wreck, that's not what we want, right? So we find, as you would think with these Let Grow projects, we would want to scaffold and perhaps help parents who may not have this sense either as an educator or just sort of the intuitive sense as a parent, to say, all right, we want to push our kids. Essentially what we're doing is pushing them out of that zone of proximal development to that productive struggle point where they are exceeding what they are comfortable with, what they maybe have done, but we're supporting them in ways that help them make that next step. So if it's a more complex task, then we want to more tightly manage them. And if it's a more simple task, we can give them, I sometimes use the steak knife or a sharp knife, say, all right, I think, okay, if I ask my 6-year-old to, I don't have a 6-year-old, but if one of my daughters were 6, say, take this knife and cut some butter, well, that's a pretty simple task. I don't need to closely monitor that. But if I would not give a 6-year-old a sharp knife and say, cut this tomato, right? I might show them. You would perhaps, and maybe 6 is I'm just using that as a random number.
No, but you're right. You start them out with
right.
The safety measures always have to be in place. And I think that's something that people need to understand. A lot of what you're doing when you're talking about, not the free range chicken for project-based learning, you have to put some safety measures into place. We have 3-year-olds using knives and cutting tomatoes, but they're using knives that are made of plastic that have been developed specifically for young kids, so that if they slip, they're not going to slice their finger off.
Right.
So yes, you scaffold those things, as you go. And you're right, that's what's crucial for the parents. The problem is if they don't start, then all of a sudden their kids get older and they realize, oh shoot, I can't go back and put that scaffolding in.
So speaking of knives, and I was joking about or I was serious, but it was funny and serendipitous that we were cutting pork loin last night. But just recently, I found my youngest really loves watermelon, so I brought a watermelon home, and she said, "Can you cut this and put it into pieces and stuff?" So I did, and then next week I bought another watermelon, and I think she may have asked me to do it, and I said, yeah, I'll get to that, and I'd forgotten to do it. Next thing I know, there's a bowl of watermelon in the refrigerator, and she had gotten this, a big, essentially a butcher knife, right, the biggest knife that we have, and cut this sucker open and did it all by herself. And I was like, well, okay, I guess she succeeded the simplicity of that task.
And yet, on the one hand, she'd watched you do it a million times at that point, right?
Yeah.
And the fact that she had some confidence. And the other thing I think is interesting when we look at this is the reason most parents are hesitant to let their kids do things is fear. It's fear. Nobody wants their child hurt. It's very painful to watch a child cry, even if it's just upset. It's hard for us as parents, and yet it's so crucial. And so, in a lot of cases, it would be, okay, well, what's the worst case scenario? Well, she might have cut herself. She could have. And then what? Then it's, okay, now we deal with handling what to do when you cut yourself. And that's some important learning too, because as an adult, I don't know about you, but I still get nervous like cutting a butternut squash because it's so hard, and it's like, right. And at my age, I do occasionally, not as frequently as my left-handed husband, but I do occasionally, nick myself when I'm cooking something or using a particular tool. And yes, it hurts, but I am resilient enough to know it's not the end of the world, and, clean it, put a Band-Aid on, and keep going.
Yeah, so maybe that's a good segue into the moral courage, talking about the resilience and maybe even some of the things that people, I don't know, maybe this is too strong language, please correct me, but have been led to believe what the ways in which we need to talk about these things or not talk about these things, the hard conversations that we try to have here, and heterodox conversations and freedom of speech. So I suppose give us just an elevator pitch, whether, I don't know how long the elevator ride is, but the elevator pitch on what moral courage, Ed, is.
So moral courage is technically, as Irshad defines it, doing the right thing in the face of your fears. What it really means for us is that we need to understand how we physically and emotionally react when things don't go our way, or when we are in a situation that somebody disagrees with us. And this goes back to resilience, because as a child, as I mentioned, you want to make sure that occasionally you do have spats with friends. Occasionally you may be left out of something. Sometimes you'll be bullied. Sometimes you might be engaged in bullying behaviors. All of these things all kind of combine to kind of build the resilience and the ability to handle things that aren't necessarily all, champagne and roses and everything's making me happy. And so when it comes to moral courage, the thing that really, really impacted me, despite the fact that I'm an educator, I've got a college degree, I know pretty good at some science. It wasn't until I really had Irshad explaining to me the concept of how our primitive brain reacts when we're disagreed with, and how that plays into how we then respond to what we see as a threat. So essentially, I'm sure you've heard of fight or flight. We've all heard of it, right? There's something, there's a threat, and your adrenaline kicks in, and your body, in your primitive brain, is like, warning, danger, danger, bear's coming at you, you've got to run or you got to stay and fight. So that's survival instinct. It's crucial for our survival. It's why human beings are still here. It's protected us, and it still does protect us. But it is a primitive enough part of our brain that it can be triggered by things that aren't really a physical threat. So we have somebody call us a name as a child, or disagree with an opinion or a viewpoint as a teenager or an adult. And our natural instinct is for this ego brain to kick in and tell us, attack. This is it's us versus them. Our survival is dependent on this. Even though we're in no physical danger, a lot of times if you're talking about social media or something on the internet, you're not even in physical proximity to whomever this other person is who wrote something that you're not happy with or that you disagree with. And so because of that, we tend to attack or defend. And even when we defend ourselves, we're frequently attacking the other person. And what moral courage is really all about is being able to take a step back, recognize that our emotions are triggered, that we're having these feelings, but I can move past my ego brain and apply some reason and some thinking to this, and move forward in a way that is not going to perpetuate what we see as polarization and those types of things. And so how that translates into action through moral courage is that we need to teach students, frankly, adults, and needed to, none of us were taught this in school, how to communicate across these differences. And it really comes down to first recognizing that you're emotional, and that the other person is emotional or was emotional when they wrote it, if we're talking about something we read, and seeking to find some common ground to start from. We tend to jump into differences immediately. And we tend to, as Irshad puts it, label people based on one or two things we know about them. So, I know that you voted for a particular candidate, then in my mind, I'm going to assume X, Y, and Z and all of these other things about you based on one thing. I'm going to take that label and it is now the sum total of everything I think I know about you, and I'm going to respond accordingly. What Irshad's work really talks about is how you have to seek first to listen and understand before you can be understood. So rather than immediately stating your case, because I think you're wrong, and I'm going to tell you why you're wrong and try to convince you that I'm right, which, by the way, it's never going to work, because you put your wall up and you're not going to listen to me anyway, because I wouldn't listen to me in that case. But that you find common ground. Hey, we're both parents. I've got kids this age, you've got kids that age, and you're finding some common ground. You recognize you're both parents, you both love your kids, and you start talking about and asking them questions about their children and their experiences, and you work your way to a level of trust through this common humanity, and then ask them about why they think the way they think. Because guess what? There's a backstory. We all have a backstory. We all have reasons why we believe what we believe. And that's been formed over time. And if you don't know somebody else's backstory, it's tough for you to understand where they're coming from. So you find that humanity, you ask the questions, you really start looking at getting to know that person, and that conversation will frequently then start to evolve. Hopefully, your other will ask you questions. Now they'll go, wait a minute, okay, you just asked me how I feel. Maybe I should ask you how you feel. And now you're having an interchange where you've lowered the level of emotion, and you're actually communicating. Will that turn into one person changing the other person's mind? Probably not. Certainly not immediately. But at the very least, both will walk away with a new understanding of another point of view, which may either eventually change your mind, or you may adjust what you believe, whether you think the other person was right or wrong. And this is how we gradually move our society into collaborating and communicating, as opposed to yelling at each other, essentially. That's a very long, convoluted way to try to explain moral courage. But essentially, that's what it's about. It's about starting from a common humanity and building a certain level of trust and talking with each other before you start talking about the disagreements or the things that you think the other person is wrong about. Because that's how we can move us into constructive conversation.
Yeah, and that constructive conversation piece is something that feels, I'm finding, and I try to approach many of these kinds of interactions with people on the internet, on social media, Twitter, Facebook, as a sort of research. So it strikes me as really interesting. It feels like increasingly that constructive conversation is foreign to many people, and we somehow have been trained or persuaded, or what, I don't know what the right
conditioned might be the best word,
right? that we are supposed to be arguing, and while there is certainly no doubt a place for arguing and trying to figure out who is right, there is a very weird thing. Like, I do tend to engage on social media, again, Twitter and Facebook, and it's interesting to, first of all, to see the differences there. And I have friends who say, "Why do you do that? You're not gonna convince them." And I don't. It's so funny to me. They think I'm trying to convince somebody when in fact I'm not. I'm trying to understand what and why they're thinking. Somebody was telling me on Facebook that those who are vaccinated are actually the ones who are getting sick with COVID now, and the unvaccinated are not. Which I said, that is so curious to me. Tell me what makes you say that? Like, I would really love to hear why you think that, right? I didn't say, I may have said in this sort of back and forth of, I don't think that's right or something like that, but it wasn't like, you're stupid. And sometimes right. I will even say, I'm not the enemy here. And it's interesting to see how that sometimes disarms people. And then I've had people who have really come out with, and this would be like on my congressman's Facebook page, so it's somebody that I don't know, but they start out with vitriol and then end up with, Oh, I misunderstood what you were saying, and because one of the things that you can do, or that happens when you take that guard down, or help them by not coming back with the exact same amount or more fire that they have. But I want to understand what you're thinking, and I do want you to understand what I'm thinking. And to the extent that you will do that, I will continue to engage in this conversation. And when eventually, to your point, like if they don't, then okay, then finally the conversation will sort of peter out. But the importance of and the value of inquiry and how we can use that to find the humanity and shared connections, and certainly not to discount the differences that we have, but to find those shared connections so that we can see each other as humans, and then to have that conversation going forward is monumental, and just seems to be just lacking in abundance in so much of what we're experiencing right now. Yes. So Moral Courage Ed does that in a way with schools.
Yes, we do. What we've got in the way of school programs and kind of spreading this philosophy, Earshad has written a number of books, but her book, Don't Label Me, is especially relevant to really the development of her moral courage method. And so we have a book study for the book for teachers, for staff. We've had some of them do it as a community read with parents. We added recently a course. It's an online course, asynchronous course to introduce moral courage to educators. It goes through both Earshad explaining the science that I mentioned about the ego brain, and then moving into how to have these discussions and a lot of role play. And we follow her through a student workshop that she does with high school students in order to really see how you can teach students how to have these discussions. And by the way, the role playing part is generally the teacher plays the other or offensive statement. We're not asking kids to jump in and do that, but ultimately maybe they'll learn how to get there. And so we're really trying to spread that information. Those are our initial offerings, because what we're seeing, and right now is a perfect time for it. The idea of being able to communicate without having to win, that, as you were mentioning, is what is so foreign. And the moral courage method basically teaches you how to go into conversations and look at the interactions differently, so that you can learn from them, and we can eventually hit a point where maybe we can sit down at a table and compromise. And even if you and I are never going to agree, maybe we've gotten to know each other just enough that we're not going to hurl insults at each other on Facebook when we see a comment. I think what this really comes back to, Drew, and you're kind of alluding to it, is how we have gotten to the point where it seems so close to impossible to have a constructive conversation. I think comes back to this whole concept of we have to win. We are in a society that more and more is judging, and it's all about judging. We're all afraid of being judged and being found wanting. The most important thing to most human beings, whether we recognize it or not, is we want to feel like we belong. We want to feel like we have value, and we don't like to be judged negatively. And what's happened is we have become a society that you're a winner or you're a loser. We do it in our sports. We've done it with our kids. By the way, the trophies trophies for everybody for participating. Where did that come from? Because it hurts to not win. And therefore, we want to make sure that you feel like you're winning. And we walk into and have been conditioned by the media, by social media, by all of the forces out there that, frankly, is all about getting us to click, keeping us engaged, getting us to school, I mean, it really has become a world where keeping our attention is the goal of everybody. Between Let Grow's website, I want you to stay on there long enough that you get the message and maybe start letting it do something. But let's be real. I think I have a great mission, and I think this is important. But ultimately, we're all competing for the attention, and because of that, this whole concept of you're either winning or losing. You either got enough likes or you didn't. This is turned us into a society that expects that every conversation is a debate. And oh, by the way, if you're courageous, if you're a good person, you're going to stand up for what you believe in. And we believe that standing up for what we believe in requires us to attack others and not open up to possibilities of shades of gray or variations on a theme. And I think that that's where we're at. We're also hyper emotional right now and constantly kept in this state by media, by societal pressures and everything we're consuming, that's what we think is normal.
Yeah, it's a strange dynamic and not intuitive to get away from, as I'm sure you're familiar with the work of Jonathan Rauch and his new book, Constitution of Knowledge, and his previous book, Kindly Inquisitors. Really, I mean, so the idea of calling names, people being called names or judged or, that kind of thing, which I read as sort of the humanitarian threat that he identifies in both of those books, and like that nobody should ever have their feelings hurt, that we should always protect people, and certainly that there's a false binary that people create, right? So if you say, oh, we should push back against that, that means you're okay with people being hurt, and you don't care about kids or care about people. Well, of course I care about people. But life is not perfect, and it's not sanitary, and in some ways, as we've mentioned with Let Grow and how we deal with kids, but it happens with adults as well. Not that I'm wishing trauma on anybody, but there is such a thing of post-traumatic growth. There is growth from failure, and I have wondered too about the sort of emotional health of people and how this. To me, it is got to be a super strong correlation in how people then react, right? So when somebody calls me a name, I don't particularly, I find it not particularly offensive. Like I was having a conversation about critical race theory or something like that, and on Twitter or something, somebody said, you're coming off as kind of racist-y. And, fine. If it doesn't hurt me, it's not something that I'm scared of. I'm pretty secure in how I think about these kinds of issues. And I think, okay, so tell me more. And I used to do that when I worked in middle schools. You say, middle school behavior is a typical thing is, so and so said something about me. The girl over there is spreading rumors that I'm I'm a slut or whatever, right? And one of the things that the intuitive reaction seems to be, oh, well, then the adult should go deal with that girl and say, hey, you can't talk like that. And certainly there's some level of appropriate, some of that makes sense, right? But my response was always, and still is, like, well, are you? And, sort of tongue-in-cheek a little bit, right? But, if you aren't, and you aren't, then why is that so hurtful? I mean, I understand the peer perception and all of those things, but if one is really secure in themselves, they go, okay, that's fine. I mean, Daryl Davis, the guy who takes the KKK robes, is maybe the best example of this. I mean, they call him subhuman, and he's like, oh, okay, that's interesting. Tell me why you say that, and let's get into the complexity of that. And so having that resilience and anti-fragility, to me, seems to be so closely tied to emotional health and security, right? So does the moral courage kind of touch on that?
I think the interesting thing about moral courage is it's not a curriculum. It's really more of a philosophy or a methodology for looking at others and dealing with others. And so on the one hand, I think that, when you're talking about name calling and things like that, a lot of what we talk about within the moral courage method and can bring into the classrooms is that idea of empathy and the idea that, there's always more to the story. And that one finite moment in time or that one label doesn't define you. And so, your example is absolutely perfect, because if somebody feels like they're being attacked, then we make the assumption that, well, they're being attacked, so the person attacking them is a bad person,
right,
and must be dealt with, and we automatically we tend to side with the victim, and even I don't even like that word, target. Let's call it a target. And so, how do we get, every one of us have had those feelings and need to recognize the line between I'm confident and comfortable with myself and I'm not going to change based on what I'm hearing, and the other side of the line, which is, what can I learn from this? If this is a perception, is this about this other person and they're insecure? Yeah, that may be. But on the other hand, is there something out there that maybe is being perceived a certain way, and I can control that and make that change myself? And the thing is if we end up in a society where it's always that the other person is bad and they hurt you, if you're the hurter, then the hurtee is completely innocent and has no part in the situation. I think that's a danger, and we've kind of gotten into that feeds that us versus them mentality, as opposed to recognizing, I always say there's truth on both sides. The truth is somewhere in the middle. There's multiple perspectives. And if you go through life thinking there aren't multiple perspectives, that you don't recognize there's as Irshad says, a diversity of viewpoint, that the diversity of viewpoint is as much, if not more important than diversity of race, religion, sexual orientation, anything else. Because no matter what label you have so much more, and what you think and your outlook on the world.
Yeah.
So it's quite the dilemma. But I do feel like part of what we really need to be doing, and what moral courage helps you start having these conversations on any topic, whether we're talking critical race theory, whether we're talking politics, vaccines, climate change, anything around there, is understanding that there is a diversity of viewpoint out there, that there is value to all of that, and bringing it together as much as we can in order to find a collaborative compromise in solving things, as opposed to everybody just standing on one side or the other, and us versus them, slinging insults at each other and doing everything they can to keep the other side from winning anything.
Right. That us versus them dynamic is just absolutely corrosive, and
it's insidious.
Yeah, and I find that to be one of the things that is driving so much of the, I hesitate to even call it discourse, because it's not really discourse, right? It is once somebody is identified as being on the other team, then we discount them, we label them, we vilify them, and say often terrible things about them. And of course, logically, that will fall apart, because at some point somebody else somebody that is on your team will be found to have something that is contradictory to something you believe, and all of a sudden we've got a downward spiral and nothing works.
Well, the other bad thing that happens, this is what's really scary, and this is what we're seeing in the education world and a lot of the debate over critical race theory. What anti-racism program are you going to teach?
Right.
And that is that because we all recognize that risk, more and more people, especially people in the middle, who maybe are the ones who kind of see both sides and would be interested in compromising, are keeping their mouths shut out of fear.
Right. Right, and that's a chilling of speech and thought and ideas that is untenable in a democracy. And I find myself to be one of those people that is trying to people say, oh, you're a centrist, you're a moderate, or something like that, and I don't know that I'm particularly centrist. I'm just not particularly interested in us versus them. I'm interested in the complexity and trying to figure out what might be the best path forward. So, in terms of, like, for example, critical race theory, I have been in contact with my local state legislator who has introduced and co-sponsored a bill to address some of the critical race theory, anti-racist kinds of things, and it's still in the early stages. But and to her credit, she's Republican. She was and has engaged with me extensively via email, back and forth, really sharing thoughts, and that's good, right? So people would. And I have friends who said, "Oh, she doesn't know what critical race theory is," and well, she actually has a law degree, and based on what I've seen, she knows pretty clearly what critical race theory is. Now, she may have some misconceptions about the application of it, the manifestations, or whatever, and I have some very strong disagreements with her. But I also think that she's right about some things, and there are some real concerns to be aware of. Of course, if you're on the left, you say, well, that means you must be a racist because you're not an anti-racist, right? So it's a false binary. I am also going to be having, and I've had him on the podcast, but be talking with just informally, the Kentucky Commissioner of Education, thinking, all right, so how can we use those gaps or bridge those gaps to come together instead of saying we're going to have a public fight and I'm going to introduce legislation and you're going to have public speaking engagements that will push back or be expected to push back, or all these versions. Let's have the conversation and really get to the bottom of how this might work. So are there ways in which you said moral courage, Ed, is more of a philosophy? I think I know, based on talking with Earshot a couple times and listening to her masterfully talk about some of these things on podcasts. But in education and in our schools with Moral Courage Ed, what would be the approach on, let's say, critical race theory and the inclusion of or exclusion of or using it, that kind of thing, or 1619 Project, or I mean, we could vaccines and all kinds of things.
All of the above.
Right.
You hit on something that's very interesting that we have looked at as we've brought Moral Courage Ed kind of into being and founded this kind of subset of Let Grow. When we started with Earshot, it wasn't about race. It wasn't about, it was just we need to learn how to talk across disagreements. And then George Floyd was killed, Black Lives Matter, everything that's happened in society has pushed this huge focus onto the anti-racism and CRT and the labels as to what it is, isn't, and all of those things. So what we look at is, and how we're trying to really identify ourselves and get people to see, which is in and of itself a bit of a challenge, is moral courage is not an alternative or a competition with critical race theory or any other anti-racism programs that are out there.
So it's not on the other side of the binary?
We're not the other side of the and I have to tell you, when we very first started talking about this, before CRT came under attack, It was really more a matter of, okay, now let's take a look at, yes, we need to teach history in a way that is representative, no question. And school districts are gonna, and states, right or wrong, are going to determine what that is. We say, whatever you're teaching, whatever side of this polarizing fence that you're on, you should supplement with moral courage, because moral courage transcends all of the individual problems and debates. And what moral courage does is help to grow a generation of students who can apply critical thinking, who can ask questions with true curiosity, and learn to pull these things together, whatever their history or belief is. If everybody on every side could at least agree that, we can sit down and talk about this, and because you're a Democrat and I'm a Republican, or whatever labels we think we're on opposites, that doesn't mean that we're enemies.
Right. Yeah.
It just means that we think differently, but we can come together and still move forward. That's where partisanship was. It's like, look, you're not going to get everything you like. I'm not going to get everything I want, but nothing's served by everybody trying to be right, because if we look at it as a win-lose situation, there's always a loser.
Right. Well, one of the things that I think is, again, not intuitively making sense to most people, and I can understand this, but we can talk about Democrats and Republicans, two-party system, or us versus them, the left versus right, or whatever. But there seems to be a misunderstanding and an idea that actually we want to kill the other side so that they don't have to fight. And I don't mean kill them literally, although that might be, but kill their ideas, kill their voice, and make it so that they're not a part of the conversation, essentially.
Right.
And that means we win. We get what we want. Of course, logically, that'll create a downward spiral. But what we really need, and again, this is not intuitive, but we need two strong parties. We need two, if we want to say two sides of each coin, that's a reductionist way to think about it. But what we have to have, just to use the parties as a example, is if you have one party that's healthy and strong and the other party is not, then the one party will go and become unhealthy and lead to excess. They will have too much power, and so you have to have that counterbalance, and that's the viewpoint diversity problem that surfaces there. And again, it's not a two-sided coin in the dialogue and discussion and around social issues, but it often comes down to sort of an us versus them. And so we want to make sure we've got to continue to fight, as ugly and tedious and frustrating as it is. I think this is the point of Ira Glasser and ACLU, of protecting the rights of Nazis to free speech, right? You have to protect those rights, even if you vehemently disagree, because eventually the downward spiral that will be created will be devastating, even worse potentially than what those Nazis might have in store. I mean, obviously the Holocaust is pretty awful, so that's quite a statement for me to make, but hopefully it makes some sense.
It's funny because what just struck me as you were talking about this is you use the analogy two sides of coin. And I like to think that I would like more people to look at it as, well, why do we have to flip a coin?
Right.
Why can't we throw a 12-sided die? Because recognizing because we constantly want to put everything in an either or is part of the problem. Whereas I like to think, and I was a total geek for a while in school. I played Dungeons and Dragons. Why aren't we throwing 12-headed dice?
Right. That's what I thought of when you said 12-headed dice, because I played Dungeons and Dragons too.
Okay, see? But so that's where I think a point you make, when we talk about moral courage, it's this philosophy. There's a very good reason the word courage is in there, because it's not easy to be the one to ask questions, to be the one to try to engage someone that has their own set of feelings. And if they haven't been taught moral courage, you may not get a good reception when you want to try to get a conversation going. It does take courage to do that. And I think that the more people that can learn some of these skills and can practice it through role play, that kids that can learn it in the course of all the subjects they're talking about. If we're always talking about both sides, okay, we're looking at history. You brought up Nazi Germany. That's a good example. Is like, okay, wait a second. There were a lot of soldiers, German soldiers, who did atrocious things and took part in the whole process. Understanding that, a lot of those were regular people. They started out as regular people. And again, not excusing what happened, but if we can understand, find that common humanity and start from there to identify how it went the direction it went and why it happened, and so many people perpetuated and got caught up in those things, that's where the lesson is and the learning is. Not to have a debate as to who was right and who was wrong,
right? Because
we're past that.
Yeah, so I'm mindful of time, and I do want to wrap up here, but I have a question that strikes me as you're talking, and I get pitches from folks asking to do podcasts and try to have conversations with folks across the spectrum of ideas and ideologies. One recently, and I'm actually considering it and thinking about it, but it was a school that was very clear in their directives, and certainly there are other schools that are like this, but they certainly were pretty heavily leaning into social justice advocacy as a main focus of what the school was there for. And I find that to be an interesting question. I mean, we have schools that focus on STEM or any variety of things, and I wonder, one of the things that, as we talk about critical race theory, anti-racism, and the ways in which that sort of manifests and finds its way into our schools, which I think many schools, almost no school is teaching critical race theory as something kids should learn that the theory is, but there are sort of derivatives of sort of a mindset, right?
Yeah, some implementations or some things that are getting pulled from that, yes.
Right. And I've seen that in some of the curriculums, and I think that's geographically located and or there's a spectrum, but the idea, one of the things that I find to be a really interesting question is, to what extent should schools and teachers view themselves as social justice activists? Not advocates, but activists, and that they should be teaching their kids to do the same?
Wow, that's a loaded question.
There's your courage, right?
Yeah, because having been a teacher, I don't think that schools can expect their teachers to be activists. I think teachers are activists. They're active in helping students succeed and empowering children. And I think that the danger in asking teachers to be activists, in my mind, is that you are actually straying completely from the idea that there are multiple viewpoints, and you're saying you need to take a stand and promote that stand. Because in order to be an activist about a specific topic, like racism, like any of those things, you generally have to be very firm in your beliefs. And as a teacher, being an activist means that I'm now more one-sided. I'm all for having a school that focuses on social justice, so long as what that school does is help teach the varying viewpoints, what's happened, why it's happened, and how to solve it, as opposed to, choosing to push a particular agenda. Not that there aren't schools out there that already do some of that. That happens. But even STEM, my first thought when you said, well, we have schools that teach STEM. Well, there's a whole lot of people out there that think science isn't real. So, maybe they're pushing an agenda too.
Yeah. Well, so it strikes me, again, leaning back into what I think is a larger problem than what many are focusing on, but the idea or the problem of illiberalism and the application of liberal science. And to the extent that anybody on the left or right is denying that or not allowing for essentially the constant and ever ongoing interrogation of ideas, and the idea that no one person has personal authority. There's some other pieces of liberal science, but I think that's just a lost art. We have so many people on left and right, and of course when you say that about the left, the people on the right say, yeah, they don't notice it in themselves, and vice versa. And so to the extent that somebody teaches social justice advocacy, I'm totally on board with. I'm an advocate of introducing and using 1619 Project if you want to, but let's make sure it's constantly subject to if this is true or interrogation. And you said it sort of entails taking a stand and defending it, and as students, clarifying and having that solidity and understanding of what you really believe in may not be quite relevant in K-12 settings. That's sure. Debatable, right? But I think the problem is the activism of you have to take this stand and be activist for it. And I think that's the problem, where we have the pushback of people saying, all right, you have to be on this side of history. And if you're not on this side of history, which means you agree with our complete agenda, then you are against us and you are to be ostracized, or some version of that. So,
right.
Anyways, go ahead if you had.
I was just going to say, and that then leads us to the difficulty for so many teachers, who a lot of teachers are learners and critical thinkers, and they like the idea of their job being teaching students to also use their brains.
Right.
And so I worry too that if we push teachers into yet one more thing, and now you need to teach activism and you need to model being an activist, and if you're someone who doesn't want to be for whatever reason, are we pushing out a whole lot of really good teachers? I mean, at what point do people not go into the profession anymore?
Yeah, well, interestingly, I was recently working with a group of teachers in an inner city, pretty rough situation, and I found it really interesting, as one of the teachers said, I team teach with this young girl, and one of the things she wanted to talk about and develop a project-based learning experience around was race and racism. It was a English language arts kind of teacher, so would have been great. And so this was a 54-year-old African-American woman, and she was actually more, I would say, right-leaning. And she said, they've taken away the ability for me to teach the classics in our curriculum and move more towards, some might say, progressive curriculum pieces. And so some of the pieces in language, she talked all of this stuff about humanity and the ways in which we are similar, not necessarily different, but certainly not in her case. I mean, she's an African American woman living in the modern world. She's not unaware of those problems and issues and not unconcerned with them, but her team teaching partner was and is a 20-something white girl who keeps deferring to, I'll say this as I don't know a better term, but more woke kind of ideology. And so, it's intuitively like, wait, something's not making sense here. It gave me a chuckle, and we all kind of laughed about it, but which is good, right?
Right.
Otherwise it's an argument. You say, well, you're wrong. No, you're wrong. You're wrong. I am mindful of time here, Andrea, and I want to make sure you have an opportunity to share any links or where folks should find you. We'll put things in the show notes, of course, for those folks who are on iTunes and we can't make links live.
So I would say the best thing anybody can do if they are intrigued by any of this is to visit our website, moralcourage-ed.org. And we've got lots of great free resources, some fabulous videos, especially one that I highly recommend that really gives us a nice animation of that ego brain problem that we were talking about, and access to learn about our offerings. I can't recommend enough the online course. We do charge for it because it was expensive to produce and we have to cover some operating costs, but for an individual educator to take it on their own time takes 5 to 8 hours. It's only $99, and we offer even greater discounts for group purchases, and have a lot of leadership teams right now of 8 to 10 folks at the district or school level taking this course as an introduction, and then probably going to offer it to all of their staff members, simply because if everybody understands just this way of thinking, it's a step forward. So I hope people will visit that, check it out, and of course contact us if you want to talk about anything that has to do with moral courage. We love to collaborate.
Right. And do you all do workshops and work with schools or organizations?
We do. Pretty much anything that's K-12 that Irshad Manji does goes through Let Grow, our nonprofit. And so there are options for, as I mentioned, the book study, which culminates with a challenge and question Zoom video webinar with Irshad. Irshad does offer some student workshops, virtual workshops, and we're always looking at what other types of opportunities are out there. Our biggest challenge is Irshad is amazing, and we haven't figured out how to clone her yet. So some of those things have a little bit of a higher price point necessarily, and we're working very hard to have a lot of wonderful free resources and some lower level entry points, because our goal is really to spread the idea of moral courage.
Right, and so moral courage -ed.org, and then letgrow.org I know is the other website, right? And I know there's a Let Grow social media, Twitter, we'll put that, and I'm assuming are there some for moral courage as well?
Irshad has her own Twitter account. The Moral Courage website's fairly new, and we are a very, very small organization. So we have plans, but right now most of what's happening on Twitter with Moral Courage is more on Irshad's professional side, and she passes things along to us as we go. We've got a little bit of a kind of K-12 is ours, and everything above 12th grade is Irshad on her own. So
and we'll link to Irshad's social media and that kind of thing. There's @Moral Courage on Twitter, and I'll make sure to try to find those as appropriate, but of course they're on the websites as well. So Andrea, thanks so much for your time. You've been generous with it. We're a little bit longer than normal, but
no worries.
It's been a great conversation, and I encourage folks to check out Moral Courage Ed and Let Grow, and Free Range Kids for that matter, and all of the other resources that we talked about.
All right. Thanks very much.
That'll do it for today's podcast episode. Thanks again for tuning in. Don't forget to review us and share us on your network so we can grow our audience to better meet your needs. Also, don't forget to find us on our websites, TeachThought.com and WeGrowTeachers.com, as well as our various social media outlets.